And what I want to first, just a couple of items of order. One is the chat, for those of you who are on Zoom, the chat has been disabled. So don't think it's your Zoom, it's been disabled by the host. Because we want to direct questions, to the whole panel, and we're hoping not, to have a bunch of side conversations. So that's the reason for disabling that. But you will be able to use your hand function when you want to ask a question, and we'll do our best to field and direct it to the right folks when that comes. I also want to remind you, if you're on Zoom, to go ahead and mute yourself. You don't want any unintended communication going on. We know how that can go. So just remember to mute yourself, mainly for your sake. Okay, so we're going to start the Dean's Significant Conversation series with, I think appropriately, a message from the Dean. So let's start here and hear from Dean Gerson.
Hello, I'm Stan Gerson, Dean of the School of Medicine at Case Western Reserve University. I want to welcome you to our first Dean's Significant Conversation series. Unfortunately, I'm not able to join you in person today as I had planned because I'm traveling, but I will be listening in remotely. I also want to thank Mark Alucio and Cynthia Caboo for spearheading this effort and for bringing this significant conversation series to fruition. As we begin the conversation today about tribalism, I want to share with you some of my reflections from a clinical perspective on the impact of tribalism. Physicians and other healthcare professionals during their practice encounter a more diverse population than perhaps any other profession, except, for instance, this transit worker in New York City. That may be an exaggeration, but you understand what I mean. Personally, I'm struck by the comments of our former head of the NIH, Dr. Francis Collins, that one of the difficulties he encountered as director was transmitting new medical information, particularly during the pandemic, to the public. His assessment was that tribalism prevented a full understanding and appreciation of the value and truthfulness of this new information. As a physician, when I walk in the room to see a new patient, I have only a few minutes to understand their backgrounds, their perceptions, their tribe, if you will, which in large part influences any information I will share with them about their health and their understanding and acceptance of it. All successful physicians take this opportunity seriously, those few precious minutes, to understand and put themselves into the shoes of the individual with whom they are speaking. In an informal, imprecise way, physicians take on that challenge of tribalism every day. I worry that we have actually moved away from valuing this perception because we no longer encourage our medical students, residents, or fellows to give us background on the community, race, ethnic background, socioeconomic situation, religious interests, and upbringing as we present cases. Information that, when omitted, does not allow us as clinicians to understand who the patient is and how their background will affect and impact their health outcomes. Instead, we err by becoming more neutral, suggesting that the outcomes of a repair of Achilles tendon, surgery for breast cancer, tubal placement for an otitis media, or even a first-in-human clinical trial matters based on the medical facts and the medical history, and not on the person who is receiving this treatment. The point of the dialogue today is to understand how our background and breadth of perceptions grandly influences our understanding of all of that information and how we transmit it, and how these perspectives bring bias into the conversation. Bias, after all, is in all of our backgrounds and perspectives. Understanding those biases can be instructional. Using that information as a tool of value to reduce the chances of what we say harms a listener is our responsibility. And we all have biases. Our colleagues are biased, our patients have a bias, our leaders have bias. Championing tribalism as the mediator of each of our worldviews will help us communicate medical information and to listen better. I look forward to today's conversation.
So, I'm the chair of the Department of Bioethics here at Case Western, and as Stan said, he asked Cynthia and I to work on this series and, hopefully get a constructive conversation off the ground that'll not be a one-time thing, but it'll be over and over. So I'm going to give you a little bit of context for that, and then, we'll push things forward. this is kind of funny to me, but on the 7th of December last year, NPR did this interview with Francis Collins. And it's there that Collins talks about, a major societal illness right now of tribalism and overpolarization and hyperpartisanship and on about every issue, which I think is, not news to any of us, right? And he said, we have an urgent need across society to recognize that we may have lost something here, an anchor to a shared sense of vision or a shared sense of agreement about what is truth. He's concerned. And he was asked about his 12 years and, what has been most striking to him in his 12 years as head of the NIH, because he was transitioning out. He had a few weeks left, right before the holidays here. And you see buried in there that he didn't think NIH was that well positioned to address these issues, which is, of course, there's some truth to that, right? Broader societal issues are going to be tough for NIH to go after, but he's still concerned, and he sees the impact on research and then ultimately practice and delivery of healthcare, which we've all seen in different ways in our lives, right? So tribalism, well, yes.
Just to make sure, are you sharing with Zoom? Are you screen sharing?
I hope so. Did they say no?
The chat's disabled, so.
Okay, let me.
We can see the PowerPoint.
The Zoom can?
Yeah.
Okay, good. Whew. Thank you. Well, worth the check. Don't want to get much further without that. All right, thank you. All right. So this was an interview. We've sent out with Dean Gerson's invitation the link to this, so you can listen to it yourself if you want, or you can read the transcript. But a couple of things, worth bolding here, worth highlighting. When he was asked about the response to the pandemic in particular, he said, I don't think I anticipated the degree to which tribalism, the tribalism of our current society, would actually interfere with abilities to size up medical information and make the kinds of decisions that were going to help people. That you heard Stan specifically reference that, right? That caught him, it put him on his heels, it caught him off guard, right? And, he's talking to himself here, it made me realize, boy, there are things about human behavior that I don't think we'd invested enough into understanding, right? What are creatures like us actually like? What does it mean to reach folks for, say, vaccine uptake or other kinds of things? And that's critical, right? It's something we in analytic philosophy have ignored a lot, right? We need to devise a morality that makes sense for creatures like us, not just an elegant, theory that has really interesting implications. Well, you see Collins struggling with this, right? We used to think that if knowledge was made available from credible sources, it would win the day, but that's not happening now, right? So he's very concerned, right? And one of the things we're going to do today is, with Dr. Kaboo, is she's going to talk about a little bit about, well, why are we so tribal? Because we all are. Even if we think we're not, we really are. It's a fact about us as creatures, right, as humans. So the next day, we have the Dean's holiday dinner, right? And Stan is at the dinner, he's walking around, he's talking to people. I heard Francis Collins, and he's really worried about this tribalism and so forth, and I am too, because we've seen it in the medical school. We've seen the way people are treating each other, especially during the pandemic, the way we look at each other. If you have your mask a little ajar, or you don't have a mask at all, or you do have a mask and you're in a group that doesn't have a mask, and so on and so forth, right? And we all, in a way, were traumatized, right? But we also, to a certain extent, went down our individual rabbit holes and made assumptions, and we probably still do, about other people, what they're like, a whole bunch of things, based on really tiny bits of information, of input. And like I said, Dr. Kaboo is going to talk about that. Dr. Anderson is going to talk about cultural influences. Dr. Williams is going to tell us a little bit about her experience, not only as a caregiver, but here in academic medicine, especially during the last few years. And then Dr. Stevens is going to tell us a little bit about organizational behavior and how you deal with what really are wicked problems. And this is a wicked problem. This is a wicked problem. It gives rise to all kinds of other wicked problems, but we need to know what that is, right? So my personal concerns You know, I'm worried that this in-group, out-group characteristic, this feature of us, and it's malleable, and that's reason for hope, right? But it seems to be beneath some existential threats we face. And Bill McKibben wrote what I think is a spectacular book in 2019 called Falter. And his worry is that the human game may be starting to play itself out. And what are existential threats today? There are more than these, but there are at least these, right? Climate change, resource exhaustion, and maybe artificial intelligence if the genie gets totally out of the bottle, all right, for really interesting reasons. But underneath all of that is sort of this in-group, out-group bit, right? How we look at the environment. We kind of, you know, fill the earth and subdue it, dominate, right? It's other than us. It's something for us to use, right? How we look at other people. It's them, you know, not us. They're the problem. No, they're the problem, right? And continued fragmentation when the only shot we got, I think, is if we start to understand ourselves as all part of the same tribe. If we can't get there, how are we going to meet climate change? How are we going to meet resource exhaustion? How are we going to bridle a little bit AI? I don't know that we can, but groups are malleable. There's reason for hope, and that's what we want to do. Civil conversation, good conversation about important things, and see if we can be constructive, hear each other, and push forward. Okay. So the Dean Significant Conversation Series, it's not just for this year. Our idea, at least, you know, Stan's and Cynthia's mine, help with Elizabeth and Amanda, you know, don't want to leave them out, is really to have this be an ongoing thing, an ongoing conversation. And yes, for now the context is tribalism, fragmentation, and academic medicine, but we see two tracks going. One is kind of current controversies, hot topics, so Dobbs and reproductive health, disinformation, academic medicine, addiction, stigma. But we want topics from you too. We want to hear from you, whether you're on Zoom or you're here in person, because we want to go with this, right? We want to run with it. And then things that have kind of cross-topic relevance, just the concept of tribalism and fragmentation, its impact on academic medicine. How tribalism, in-group, out-group, impacts science, methodology, pedagogy, healthcare delivery. And then, you know, issues that are very important, of course, in academia, like academic freedom, freedom of speech, privileges, responsibilities. So, you know, we'll solicit other ideas from you, and we'll keep this conversation going if it gains some traction and seems to be valuable for folks. All right. So, boy, there are things about human behavior that I don't think we had invested enough into understanding. Well, isn't that true? Well, let's try. We'll give that to Dean Gerson. We're going to try, and so we're trying, okay? And I turn things with that over to Dr. Kaboo. Okay, go over to you, Kaboo. Slideshow. There you are.
Hello, I'm glad to see so many of you here in person as well as those of you on Zoom for our inaugural Significant Conversation series. I have a really hard time standing still when I'm talking, but I don't have much of an option now, so if you see me fidgeting, it's just like my natural high energy state. But what I'm going to do is just talk a little bit briefly about the neuroscience of in-group bias. Briefly, I am a neuropsychologist. Neuropsychology studies brain behavior relationships and professor of neurology, and I have the privilege of serving as that vice dean for faculty in the School of Medicine, so I really work for you, okay? I want to put a preface there. I'm only going to talk about a little bit of the neuroscience of in-group bias, because there's no way that we can even begin to cover this topic. There's a long history within psychology looking at in-group, out-group dynamics and all of this science, and we've got an idea now in terms of what some of the neuroscience is behind that as well. What I'm going to do is I'm going to start out with a quote that's been attributed to William James. Some of you may know this, but I really like, William James is the father of psychology in the United States. And William James, as well as Dewey and Peirce, were the ones that kind of helped really develop the first American philosophical tradition of pragmatism. And pragmatism is something that Dr. Stevens, JP, and I have talked about and has informed some of the collaborations we've done, where really it centers on the idea of diverse ways of knowing and understanding. And it does posit that empirical methods are a way to discern truth, okay, including ethical challenges and problems. And so I think that this is relevant, and I really liked this. I don't know if it was William James who said that there's some controversy in there, but I think it's a nice way to frame the discussion series as we move forward, that people think they're thinking when they're merely rearranging their prejudices. And that holds for all of us. And there's an underlying biology as to why that's true. But biology is not destiny. So our brains naturally categorize things. It helps us chunk information so we can make decisions, so we can work efficiently at coming to decision points rather than think of all the elaborate possibilities, because that would slow us down, particularly in high-stress situations. But culture influences how categories are formed within our brains. And the need to belong to a group is a defining feature of human nature, and some have posited that the larger brain size of humans and non-human primates is attributed to the fact that we are social beings and we interact in this highly social environment with complex social rules. And groups are advantageous. They provide better access to commodities, we've got security, we've got kind of our tribe around us to protect us if necessary. So there's clear advantages to having groups and how those categories are formed. And those groups can be along a whole host of different ways. We can categorize groups based on gender, based on race, based on education, based on where they work. Does that sound familiar within the School of Medicine, right? Based on discipline, based on where you live. When I first came to Cleveland, I didn't realize there was a big deal between East and West Side, right? Boy, was I educated, right? So I think we naturally categorize in different ways. And these categories are myriad, and there can be intersectionality within those categories as well. Our brains have evolved to support our ability to live in complex social settings. And these evolutionary changes are related to distinct neural correlates in perceptual, affective, and cognitive processes that support the development and maintenance of groups, because groups are important to our survival. So what I'm going to do is just briefly touch a little bit on just some gross neuroanatomical features that in terms of looking at this neuroanatomy. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to cite a neurologist from the 19th century, Broca, who first came up with the conception of the limbic lobe, which is right here on the mesial surface of the brain. This is the front, this is the back, top, bottom. You can see the cingulate gyrus here, the ventral medial prefrontal region. You've got your parahippocampal gyrus, hippocampus, and amygdala sitting right anterior to that, temporal pole. This is the undersurface of the brain, front up here, back here. You've got orbital frontal cortex, intimately linked to reward centers deeper in the brain, and insula, which is right here. As you prise open the temporal sulcus, fissure, you can see the frontal lobes here, temporal lobe, and this is your insula, which is really important, particularly for interoception and aspects related to empathy. Kind of interoception, how we feel inside, the feelings, the emotions and feelings that arise internally. When we have sadness, we experience joy, and so on. In addition, when we're looking at kind of social cognition, other important areas that I'm going to reference are the fusiform face region and this general region, temporal parietal junction right here, and the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. And that's it for neuroanatomy, guys. You can go, phew, I'm done, all right? I do a better job when I teach the medical students. All right, so I'm borrowing kind of the structure of this talk on a really nice review by Molenberg's, and there are 4 big buckets. One, there are a lot of data that we categorize in groups differently. And so a seminal study was in 1954, the Robert Caves experiment. And what they did is they took 22 fifth grade boys. Well, first of all, that's a brave experimenter, right? Because I don't know how many of you raised a fifth grade boy, but they're a lot of work. 22 fifth grade boys, and they divided them into 2 groups. And the boys named, one was the Eagles, and I think the other was the Rattlers, right? And they kind of bonded together and the whole thing. And then they put them in situations in which they were in conflict or competition, like kickball, like baseball. And what they saw evolve over time was at first just like calling names, singing derogatory songs, things like that. But eventually it came to physical altercations, right? And they're hitting each other, they're fighting, the whole bit. So they thought, oh, let's pull back. Let's see what happens if we put them in a neutral setting where there's no competition. And they put them then into like a cafeteria just to share a meal. Before you know it, they're flinging food at each other and it's a food fight, okay? So there are these competitions that arise, and you have very much this in-group and out-group mentality where these boys are competing with each other, all right? But what's interesting, and this is something I want us to tuck aside for later, is that they could get the groups to collaborate together and work well together if they had a superordinate shared goal. And if you have a goal that you're sharing, you can overcome that competition and that in-group, out-group mentality to achieve that goal. Tajfel replicated this in a very similar design, but he tried to, he tried to push it down to its most basic level in terms of group membership. And he literally randomly divided participants into two groups, let's say the red team and the blue team. They didn't even know who else was in their group, but there was one group where it was, this is my group, this is the in-group, that's the out-group. And he had them divide rewards between in-group and out-group members, okay? So not surprisingly, if you have this much money to give somebody, you're going to give more to your in-group member, they found, despite this very trivial distinction about who's in your group. More money to your in-group member, and the out-group is going to get less. What happens if you say, look, this is how much money you're getting, but we're going to give you even more money, so in-group could get more, but the out-group's going to get more. They still preferred to get less money and make sure the out-group got less. Okay? Volts in 2009 replicated the Tajfel experiment in an fMRI scanner and found that once again, regions within this grand limbic lobe that Broca had identified in the 19th century and temporal parietal junction were more active when they were trying to discriminate between in-group versus out-group, okay, in terms of allocation of reward and in-group favoritism, suggesting that these social regions, these limbic regions, plus some other critical regions in terms of social cognition are involved and important in terms of these kind of decisions. I'm going to take a little bit of a detour just because I think this is important as well, and others in this room I'm sure know more about this than I do. But this also lends itself to the idea of social identity theory in groups. And social identity theory acknowledges that both individual characteristics and socially shared characteristics like your group membership help define your place in society. Think about it. When you meet somebody, what's one of the first things you say or you ask? Well, what do you do? And automatically you're categorizing them and you're making assumptions based on what their occupation is. We do that when we see patients. We do that when we see a whole host of other people. And part of it is that we inherently want to make ourselves feel better and good, and often better or good means better than. So we try and compare ourselves favorably to others and compare our in-group favorably or more favorably than to the out-group. So what the problem is this automatically leads to bias, okay? It leads to bias, in which we are not good unless the other group is less than. And that's very problematic. So going back to we look at, we categorize in-group different than out-group, our other group, okay? We also experience the actions of in-group members differently, and this I think is fascinating, okay? So once again, classic psychology experiment from the mid-50s, and they had Princeton students and Dartmouth students, and watched this football game in which evidently there was quite a bit of rough play. And the Princeton students, hey, our team did nothing, it was all Dartmouth. And Dartmouth students were saying, well, no, both were engaging in rough play, okay? Then they showed them actual video clips, okay, of the game. Indisputable in terms of everybody seeing exactly the same information, okay? And those differences still persisted. And so Hastorf and Cantrell thought, well, wait a second. Are they literally experiencing something different? Because the visual stimulus is exactly the same. Is their experience literally different between these two groups based on in versus out group membership? Molenberg's repeated this in 2012 with a simple button pressing test. Once again, he had people randomly assigned to a red and a blue team, or maybe it was blue and yellow, I can't remember, right? And they did a little bit of a team building exercise, okay, separately, and then they just had to press a button. And they had to judge based on videos which team pressed the button more quickly. And it was pretty apparent that there was an in-group bias. So replicated this finding based on something as trivial as you come in for a psychology one-on-one experiment, you're in this group versus that group. So these are profound effects. What he did then as well is he did the same task using an fMRI scanner and examined brain responses, because the real question is, are they actually seeing something different in the brain during that perceptual, or is that they see the same thing and then afterwards they make a decision and that skews their response? That's why the response exists. And so what he found is there was increased activation inferior parietal lobule during action perception, which is an area critically important for action perception, and it correlated with higher in-group bias. So while they're actually watching it, you're seeing greater activation in this region of the brain that's important for actually perceiving that. And when it came to the decision-making stage of this, there was no differences whatsoever, and it was not moderated at all either in terms of the degree of in-group bias. So this means that we're actually seeing and experiencing things that they see differently at a neural level, which is amazing to me. This study and similar other kinds of studies have been replicated and or similar findings from EEG as well as other functional neuroimaging studies. 3, we empathize more with in-group members. And I'm just going to give one quick example here. Zhu examined if regions known to be active when receiving pain, so kind of regions within that limbic lobe that are involved in the pain matrix, are more active when viewing videos in which in-group versus out-group individuals receive a painful stimulus. So you'd have videos, and they kind of looked at group membership according to race in this study, and then you'd have like an image of an individual maybe getting punctured with a needle with their hand versus just a cotton swab on their dorsal aspect of their hand. And they looked at what's going on in the brain when this happened. And they found that there was higher activation in these pain matrix regions, which they interpreted as more indicative of greater empathy in favor of in-group versus other group or out-group. And there are lots of other studies that found similar results. The important thing too is that you know that this empathic response can be regulated. Imagine they looked at, somebody did a study looking at acupuncturists, and they had absolutely no problems whatsoever with sticking needles in somebody. So experience can modulate that and regulate that, as well as cognitive resources can regulate your response so that you respond equally. So there are ways that we can come around this. And then this is interesting too. 4, we perceive faces of in-group members differently. You know, there actually is a robust scientific literature that people remember faces of their own race better than other race faces, which is amazing, right? Particularly since race is not a biological construct. And group out of Stanford, including Jennifer Eberhard, found that there's actually greater activity in the fusiform face region when participants view the same race faces. So you're actually expending more neural energy and activity to processing faces from your in-group than those who are in out-group or other group, which is incredible to me as well. Once again, these things can be modulated. We also know that we perceive faces of in-group members differently as well. Cunningham in 2004 did a really nice study in which he looked at white and black participants, and what they did is they flashed either a white or a black face on this screen, and they did it very, very quickly, so it'd be before you were conscious of the face and or a little bit later when you could be conscious of the face. To look at is, you know, are people able to regulate? How quickly can they regulate their response? And what we found is that whereas when they were presented prior to being conscious of that, of the stimulus, that there was a higher amygdala activity, which indicates greater fear, anger, negative emotion in general, or it can in this situation, and that was associated with higher implicit bias. So white participants viewing a black face had greater amygdala activation, and that was correlated then with higher implicit bias. There was no amygdala differences evident during the longer stimulus presentation, suggesting that people were able to kind of regulate that response, and that included more of these dorsal regions within the frontal lobes, that they were able to regulate that response so that the response was neutralized. But other data has shown that that regulation comes at a cost in terms of your ability to use those kind of resources as efficiently and quickly. Okay, so This has just been a real snapshot, a teaser, if you will, in terms of what some of these data are, which I think is fascinating. But I think what we need to know is, first and foremost, that humans evolved to adjust to living in complex social settings. Okay, we are social relational beings. These evolutionary changes are associated with perceptual, affective, and cognitive neural correlates that support group membership because group membership is advantageous, okay? But this can result in in-group biases that operate implicitly and very, 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 very fast. However, we can regulate our biases through experience and by exerting cognitive control and by greater exposure to ideas and diverse ways of knowing and doing. So this relates to really the broader overarching goals of this entire significant conversation series, at least from my perspective, and I think Mark's as well as Dean Gerson's, is how do our own in-group biases impact our culture here and our work within the School of Medicine? How can we better regulate our own in-group biases? And how do we demonstrate a curiosity and openness to diverse ways of knowing and doing and thinking, excuse me, while holding firm to our shared norms and commitment to scholarship? And this really reflects, once again, pragmatism. As I said earlier, diverse ways of knowing, using empirical methods, and as Francis Collins said, to ultimately ascertain truth and get closer to truth. So what I want to do now is just, those are some general ideas. I'm going to briefly introduce then our panelists who are going to provide some comments as well and set them up for just a little bit here. Excuse me. So Eileen Anderson is going to follow first, and she is going to speak on the impact of tribalism and culture. Eileen is an associate professor in the Department of Bioethics at the School of Medicine and medical anthropologist. She also serves as the director of the Center for Medicine, Society, and Culture. That's going to be followed by Dr. Sherry Williams, who's going to speak about the impact of tribalism in academic medicine. As Mark Alicio had said earlier, she's a professor and chief of the medicine service at the VA and vice chair at the VA, University Hospital's Department of Medicine. She's a pulmonologist and has experienced tribalism and fragmentation not only in academic medicine, but also in healthcare delivery, especially during the pandemic. Then we're going to pitch it over to Dr. Stevens, J.P. Stevens, who's going to define what wicked problems are. It's a concept I came across several years ago. Actually, I think Dean Davis introduced me to it, and I think it's really a powerful construct for thinking about some of the challenges that face us now and how we have to really think out of the box with diverse ways of knowing and understanding, and that the traditional linear problem-solving methods are not going to be the ones that are going to help us solve this all by themselves. We've got to think differently. So I'm very excited about this. I hope that you see that the panel reflects diverse areas of expertise, and we're really excited about this. So I'm going to stop now, and I'm going to set up the slide then for Eileen, and we can get moving. Okay. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Anderson.
Thank you so much, Cynthia, and thank you for your presentation as well. Really appreciated it. And thank you for inviting me here. Thank you, Mark, and thank you, Dean Gerson. It's a privilege to get to be here today and bring kind of strange background for sure. And that probably has to do with I'm really interested in adolescent well-being in context of rapid cultural change and how the institutional level can help mediate that. So that is a messy topic. So I did end up doing doctoral training in psychological and medical anthropology. I have a doctorate in human development and psychology, and I did a postdoc in culture and developmental neuroscience. So really we'll kind of follow on some of what Dr. Kubu brought to us. And I want to introduce the notion of cultural models. So today, very briefly, I'm going to talk about a shared definition. What are we talking about when we talk about the word culture, tribalism, introduce or reintroduce? You're probably very familiar with the notion of cultural models. How can we use them? I'm going to bring a couple examples from my own research over time, thinking about these categories of in-group and out-group and how they are malleable and how we can intervene them, and then some tools that you may be more and less familiar with. So a very basic definition that we use of culture are beliefs and behaviors shared by a social group. And with our students, I kind of emphasize that there are three bins. So that belief thing is that realm of thoughts and ideas and ideals and images, right? This kind of stuff. And then there's the realm of behavior. What do people actually do? What do they do habitually without thinking about it? Like, we didn't have to tell anyone to come in this room and sit in the chairs. Nobody sat on the table. Nobody came up here to sit. These are cultural habits. How far away we stand from each other when we talk, although that's altered over pandemic time, hasn't it, when you're standing in line at the grocery store? All these things are deeply cultural. Sometimes it's very deliberate behavior. Sometimes it's individual, small group, or ritualized behavior. So, but that whole realm of what we actually do, and then it has to be shared by a social group. What a meaningful social group is, as you can tell, is really malleable. It may be some kind of cultural group, an ethnic group, a racial group. It could be a group of identification with gender. It could be gaming culture, or all, thinking about all the different kinds of affiliations and groups that are part of our identities and are moving throughout the world. So when we think about what is tribalism, and I am just on the verge of needing and not needing reading glasses, so excuse me with my awkwardness, I'm still trying to figure it out. When we talk about culture in those social groups, and as we bridge to thinking about tribalism and in-group, out-group, the other word I want to really throw in there, a concept that is so essential, is that of power. Right? All of these different cultural groups, all of our subcultural groups, all of our affiliations, they don't have equal power. And you're much more aware of the ones generally in which you don't have the power, right? We consider this epistemic privilege sometime, that if you're in the position of lower power, you have to understand your own situation, but also the situation of those who have more power in the situation that matters, such as academic career progression or whatever it may be. So I want to say that all of this is imbued with power, which is another reason why it matters so much to all of us. So, I wouldn't be a social scientist worth my salt if I didn't mention the kind of history or give a nod to the concept of tribalism and the language of tribalism. Anthropology has a very long history of studying human evolution, human history, as Cynthia was talking about, and the importance actually of really early tribes when our human ancestors were foraging and hunting and gathering, where in-group behavior, even if you didn't like the people in your group, it was essential for survival. And what has happened to that kind of neural development over time as societies have gotten more complex, and what happens to some of these characteristics as our societies and technologies have exploded. But it is a word that also connotes colonialism, exoticization, and other negative kind of connotations, although it has been reclaimed often in the world of political science. Often, a lot of political scientists talk about it as meaning more nationalism, which is an identity group, but it's more behavioral and kind of less in that realm of the beliefs and behaviors. So I just want to give a little asterisk on that term itself, that it is a fraught term, and to be aware of how we're using it when we use it. So the ways that we tend to think about it are in many of the social sciences are more with the in-group, out-group kind of connotation, rather than in the way it's often used now. Look at this is awful. It is a kind of a fear-based political tribalism that we are seeing, which is more the type, I think, that Dr. Collins was talking about. And there's been a subtle shift when we think about what's happening with our in-group, out-group, or thinking about tribalism, whereas kind of evolutionarily, it was about fostering in-group survival, fostering in-group pro-social behavior to really help human adaptation. There's a shift toward a connotation of rather keeping other people out, right? The kind of tribalism we're talking about that is damaging. It is a how can I, in a world of scarce resources, how can I get more and keep those other people out, right? And we can all come up with lots of ways in which that's been up for us in recent years. Okay, so what I want to introduce, whoops, apparently I'm not good at this either, is the notion of cultural models. So a definition from cognitive anthropology are the cognitive emotional structures and patterns of behavior socialized throughout the life course, right? So these are learned. We know that humans have a dual system of inheritance, genetic and cultural. And what we are learning more and more about, which is so exciting in our sciences like epigenetics, is the ways in which our cultural experiences actually impact our biological and genetic expressions. So our cultural models are based on shared experience with a group and stem from values that are really important to that group. So let me give you a quick example. Worldwide, all mothers want to be good mothers, right? But what, barring individual pathology, but what that means to be a good mother, to be a good parent, may be diametrically opposed. It can be socializing a very different kind of child, right? A very, I could say kind of a rough example, but an example that I'll briefly mention that I hear in my work all the time is even parenting differences that play out in Cuyahoga County about spare the rod, spoil the child, versus we do not want any kind of severe or harsh discipline, and certainly not physical discipline, right? Both want to be the best parent they can. The way it plays out, the reasons for that, the heritage, the micro context, the meso-level cultures can be very different. So we have to consider these kind of different levels of analysis. So we have cultural models for virtually all of our social roles and our social categories. The problem is we are not often aware of them unless they come into conflict in some way. Good professor, good student, good doctor, good patient. And these things, they dictate our ideas, they can profoundly impact behavior, and they get codified into policy and practice. And we can think throughout our own history in this country of the many ways in which we have codified people into less than fully human. Right? Those have been part of our laws. And, I would argue in some ways we still have a lot of problematic policy about not bringing everyone to the table fully human. So as Dr. Kubu mentioned, these cultural models that we carry around help us process a massive amount of information very quickly, right? They're not without their use. But trying to become aware of the ones that matter in our lives, in our careers, in our practice is critically important. And for that reason, I really value this conversation and the work that we have the opportunity to do here. So I'm going to give you a couple quick examples from my own work where these cultural models come into play. So one, I have been working in Belize, Central America, for 26 years, and it's an incredibly multicultural country, one of the most in the world. It's considered to have some of the best interethnic relations in the world, which does not mean it's perfect. But what it does play out is different groups kind of have power in different areas of the country. But there are two groups that are dominant in Belize that are both African-descended groups. They have incredibly different histories, and I could tell you quite a bit about both. One is Creole, one is Garifuna or Garifuna, also important where you are and the politics of that. Very different cultural histories, different languages spoken, different cultural practices, different rituals, different foods, etc. And people can tell right away if you are Creole or you're Garifuna in Belize. And it's a difference that matters. They're distinct groups. One of the projects I was involved with in Los Angeles at UCLA was African-descended migrants to Los Angeles. What happened with these two Belizean groups, which had massive implications for adolescent well-being, was that they were racialized overnight from Creole or Garifuna to they were black in South Los Angeles and had started to have experiences of racism that they had not necessarily encountered in this way in Belize. And that was a central thematic and often traumatic experience for families in this context, right? So racial group, the way people saw in-group, out-group was malleable, and in this case, in a kind of rapid and traumatic way. And there's lots of examples about how race is socially constructed all around the world as one example, gender as well, and others. Another example I want to talk about in institutional mediation is I am working with guardians ad litem in the state of Ohio. These are people who are making really important decisions for the health and well-being of children in the cases that I'm working with. It's a huge minority of children in Ohio who interface with some kind of system due to a contested divorce, a medical issue, foster care, juvenile justice, or many other things. The guardians in the state of Ohio, by and large, are JDs who may have, and most of them have very little training at all in child development or child well-being, and they are making life and death decisions for children with no awareness, in many cases, that they themselves have models that they're making from their own childhood background for what's okay and what's not okay, and which parent can a child live with or not live with, things like that. There's a lot at stake. So we created cultural model questionnaires. This is just a little blip of one of them. And the first thing we are requiring guardians to do now in the state trainings is give themselves the questionnaires. What are your own models for healthy child development, healthy parenting, etc.? And it's been an aha. Most people are not aware, unless they've had some reason to become aware, that they're even walking around with a right way and a wrong way to do things, when really there are lots of ways that really work, and it depends on the context a lot of the time, barring abuse, neglect, and things like this. So we can turn these understandings into tools that can help us broker difference, broker conflict, and move on to better health, in this case, for the children of Ohio. The final thing I'm going to mention briefly is, much to my own surprise, I ended up doing a lot. I'm not an infectious disease specialist by any means, but I ended up doing a lot of public commentaries, NPR and other organizations, when the pandemic hit on what does a mask mean? Why do people wear a mask? Why do they not wear a mask? Why do people get vaccinated? Why do they not get vaccinated? On and on and on. And so I did a lot of listening about why are you wearing a mask? Why aren't you wearing a mask? And it was an amazing thing. I ended up pretty much saying the same thing in every interview I did, which is this black and white model that got set up, this all or nothing. This mask indicates these are your politics, these are your beliefs, this is who you are. And, no mask, this is who you are. Was so grossly wrong and so simplistic. But it calcified, right? Because we're talking about something with very high stakes, right? Life and death, disability and suffering. We are talking about something where there's a lot of unknowns, right? We're still learning. How does this COVID-19 thing work and unfold? So the stakes were high, emotions were high, and that is when these categorical systems that are so knee-jerk and are wired in to some extent until we take the time to rewire them, come online to the tune of massive kinds of hatred and hate crimes that we have all been seeing. Some of you are probably familiar with these. This is a cultural model that's been around since about the mid-1980s, developed by Arthur Kleinman at Harvard Medical School. This was an early cultural model. We teach our medical students this about how do you understand your patients' cultural models of what brings them in. Because Dr. Collins initiated, and Dean Gerson, I think, even better articulated, that it's not just about health communications. It's not just about how do we deliver these data and our scientific knowledge in the best way possible, but we have to think about uptake. How are people hearing it? What are their cultural models? What are their filters? How does it align or not align with things that really matter to them? And in the social sciences, we tend, instead of compliance, we think about patient adherence, right? What choices do patients make? You can have the best medicine and the best communications, and a patient can walk out of your office and choose to do nothing you just said, and you probably know what that feels like. Understand, the more we can bring on those behavioral sciences and the meaning to understand why people are or are not participating, the better clinical outcomes we get. This is one tool that's been useful in that front. So I will leave it there, and thank you so much. And I'm very excited to turn it over to Dr. Williams. Thank you.
Well, good evening. I want to thank everyone for inviting me to be here. I do not have a PowerPoint presentation, in large part because I was asked about sort of tribalism in academics as well as tribalism within the clinical context. And I find myself, as I thought about this after we had our sort of preparation meeting, reflecting on quite a few of my own personal experiences. And so I'm a bit of a storyteller, and I'd like to share some stories with you about some, how would I say, salient events in my own academic career and in the careers of many women as well as minorities in academia, and the lessons that I sort of have reflected on and have learned a bit about myself and about others. And I want to thank the social scientists and neuroscientists for going before me, because I think hearing the science helps to explain a lot of the things that I experienced and a lot of the conclusions that I came to when talking about my own experiences and the experiences of others. So I'll just say, despite my youthful appearance, which is some Clairol here, I enrolled in medical school many years ago. And at the time when I started medical school, the school did not really anticipate having women in medical school. And we would go to anatomy lab, and of course you would change for anatomy lab, and because they never planned on having women, and even though I wasn't in the class, the first class or even the second class or third class of women, for some reason we didn't put a locker room for women, and the answer was to hang up a rope in the locker room with a sheet over the rope, and then to say to the women medical students, well, what's wrong with that? What's wrong with that? And when the women students complained, it was, well, there are not that many of you. Can't you just go along? Can't you just fit in? And you know, it was this idea that we were sometimes annoying and being nitpicky and aggravating, right? And so when I look back at that and I think about sort of the lesson that I learned about that whole dynamic, ultimately the women, you know, prevailed in terms of changing things. But it was this notion of, number one, inability to sort of empathize with the situation that the women students found themselves in. It was the inability to sort of change, right? It's always been this way. The locker room has always been this way. And so why the need to change? Why the need to change? And so I think one of the things that I learned early in my career, and I'm sure all of us face this every day, is that change is hard. Change is super, super hard, even when it's good for us, and even when presented with, you know, robust evidence, like there are 30 women in the class, right? And they are here every day. They have been here for the last several years. They're not going anywhere. There's robust evidence that you need to have a women's locker room. So change is hard, and what makes change exceedingly hard is something that we heard earlier, which is the ability to empathize with the situation and sort of the plight that others are in. The difficult nature. And why do I bring that up? Because I think our way forward in some respects is, how do we help others to empathize with the situation and the plight that others find themselves in? How do we motivate change in people when they are resistant to change, even in the face of, you know, concrete evidence? So moving on, when I finished and moved through my career, I had various experiences, certainly in terms of what has been outlined in terms of this notion of the in group and the out group. And Certainly as a woman, and certainly as a Black woman, I have been the out group in many situations. And I can recall very vividly, even going back to pre-med, being in class, chemistry class actually, and people partnering up to be partners in chemistry, and everybody paired up. I, of course, was the only one in class, and no one would be my partner. No one volunteered to be my partner. The teaching assistant assigned someone to be my partner, and the person that got assigned sighed, rolled their eyes, and said, "Why do I have to be her partner?" So, what's wrong with me? What's wrong with me? You don't even know me. And so it's this notion that has been so eloquently brought forth by the two scientists before me, that we go into things with preconceived notions about who someone is and what they're about and what their capabilities are, and how do we sort of get past that. And one of the things I realized in that experience was it's because people have not ventured too far from their tribe and have not had enough world experiences. And even though I initially, and this was the lesson that I learned, felt victimized by this, I realized also that I too did a lot of that as well. I went to a school where I never knew what a bagel was because I had been raised in an all-Catholic environment. I did not know what a kosher dining hall was. And so I had to also move out of my tribe and my circle and have a better worldview. And so to the point that was made earlier, we all have our sort of tribe, our group that we are comfortable with, and the in-group and the out-group. So in moving towards career as a physician, after finishing undergrad and graduate school and medical school, certainly in the years of my travel, I have come to realize, and there's actually been lots of literature published about the differences between men and women in academia. And a lot of literature has actually looked at some of the salient features of men and women in academia. And certainly one of the things that holds true is that women are not, for a whole host of reasons that I know our scientists could explain better than I, are not the networkers that men tend to be. And I know that for many women, as they move through their career, there's not only the career challenges, but also the challenges of being wife, mother, raising children, and competing things for time and work that don't allow for some of the networking and engagement that is necessary. And quite honestly, as we progress in careers and progress in terms of job opportunities, networking becomes very important. And if you haven't been able to partake in those kinds of networking things, it becomes difficult. So with respect to the academics at what I called a very unique level, as I advanced in my career, was something that I think all of us have experienced with respect to tribalism sort of between scientists versus MDs versus are you an assistant professor? Are you a full professor? Are you an internist like I am? Or are you a surgeon? I never will forget, in my younger years, I was dating a urologist, and we had talked about getting married, and we actually fell out because he made the fatal mistake of saying, well, you know, my life and residency are more busy than yours. And I was, you know, a critical care doctor working in an ICU, you know, and I thought to myself, what a, you know, jerk kind of thing to say. But I came to realize that here again is certain notions about the type of people who are surgeons, the type of people that go into certain specialties, and their personalities. And what did I come to realize? That a saying my mother has, birds of a feather flock together, and so a certain amount of the things that people say and do is sort of learned and sort of perpetuated and groomed and sort of fertilized and grows such that it becomes their source of truth, right? Their source of truth. And who do they believe or get their source of truth? It's the people that they are with and the people who think like them, and therefore they are right. That's the source of truth. And so that is what sort of takes place for us in academia, and spilled over to something that I'll now switch to in terms of my experiences as a critical care physician in the pandemic. So a couple of things about something that I think I did not realize until after spending a lot of time as a critical care doctor, as well as in my role as one of the board directors for Cuyahoga County Board of Health. And this speaks to a different time that we find ourselves in society. And as was mentioned, you know, previously when we were all in the forest as hunters and gatherers, you know, you sort of needed each other, whether you were in this group or that group, to survive. Things have changed from the standpoint that now we have social media. And whereas before people were sort of in their sort of tribes and they were siloed from everyone else, or you were in your tribe and you needed another group for survival, now that is not as relevant. And actually, one of the things about social media is that it is sort of self-fulfilling and self-perpetuating, right? So the things that you get on social media are the things that social media has found interest you, and the things that tend to align with your views and your values and how you think. And that becomes your source of truth and your reference point, and that becomes who you trust. And I think one of the things that I found as a physician taking care of patients in the ICU, and it was a constant theme for me in taking care of patients, was I don't trust this person or that person. And so I don't believe that. That's not what I read or what I heard. And so who you trust and who you believe is very much predicated upon the tribe that that you are with, and so it doesn't matter what evidence is presented to you, but you know, we have to find a way to sort of get beyond that group of individuals that is sort of your bubble. And that can be very challenging. And I think one of the things that I learned during the pandemic was the way to get beyond it is really to expand the bubble by listening and to actually work within the expanded bubble instead of poking holes in the bubble or dismissing the bubble or trying to rationalize the bubble. It's interesting that people were sort of, how would I say, taken off guard by the fact that when presented with evidence or data, people just don't believe it. And I'm going to tie all this back to my opening story, which is, you know, the university where I was even presented with the data that there are women here, lots of them, they've been here, and they're not being nitpicky to ask you to have a women's locker room. It's the same thing. We're presenting you with data, and yet you have trouble embracing it. Why is that? Because there's trouble empathizing with the situation. There's trouble in terms of belief and your source of truth. And there's trouble with change and resistance to the change that is required in order to move the needle. So yes, we have to change and move differently in terms of wearing a mask and social distancing and where we go. And people are resistant to change because they have difficulty empathizing with the situation that we're in and accepting that their source of truth and who they believe could possibly be different or possibly not be absolute to the point of completely this way or completely that way. And I think when I look at where do we go from here, there are a couple of things that I find myself saying we have to find a forum for, and I'm so glad that we're starting with this, was in helping people to empathize with the plight of others, helping people to sort of roll with resistance. How do we handle people, and how do we sort of not get frustrated and put off and bash and badmouth people who are resistant or somehow think because they're hardwired in their minds to think and see things differently? And how do we get to the point of expanding the the and the experiences that people have, because it's in expanding the bubble and the experiences that people have that helps them to really come to empathize, to appreciate views that are outside of their bubble. I will tell you that, and then I'm going to stop talking because I know there's someone else coming, and I want to be respectful of your time. There is the notion of, yes, diversity, but one of the things that I think becomes super important is the idea of inclusiveness or inclusivity. Because one of the things that makes it incredibly hard for people to get past their resistance and to have trust and to empathize is to be included. And sometimes when we have not listened to people and we have not included people, then we won't get that empathy. We will continue to get resistance, and we cannot foster change. So thank you very much for letting me be a storyteller, and I am going to invite our next speaker up.
JP, you just have to tie it with a bow and
Oh my
solve the
God.
problem.
If you saw me on my phone, I wasn't texting all my friends in this room. I was taking a lot of notes, and so my notes I will be using my phone. And so thank you, everybody. My name is John Paul Stevens. A lot of people call me JP. I'm on the faculty in the Department of Organizational Behavior in the Weatherhead School of Management. And I just want to say, since I have the platform, I'll be aware of the time. I'll keep but I'm just very excited to be here. I think we're talking about tribalism in a university that kind of forgot to celebrate the union between Case Institute of Technology and Western Reserve College. We're in a university where, we just got our employee engagement results back. They're not great. And, we're at a university that is known for being siloed. Which, of course, and we always kind of follow that up with, well, all of higher education is siloed. Well, that's great. But the point is, we're at this university. What are we going to do about it? So when I got the invitation from Mark and Cindy to be here, I was very excited, very happy to say yes to that. It's something that I care about. I studied positive work relationships, coordination, and teamwork, and the experience of coordination. So I want to come back to what you were saying, Sherry. So I have all these notes. So I'm like, where do I even start with this? There's so much I want to say. But I bring that up because I think the key problem in coordination across contexts, at least from the research that I'm familiar with, is relating across differences. That's if I had to sum up coordination research and the core aspect of it, and if you think of from sports, right? Folks in different roles have to figure out how to work together. If you think of it certainly in the science of team science, which I'm sure quite a lot of you in this room and on Zoom are navigating yourselves, we know that the splintering based on identity, on professional identity in this case, is very real and very pervasive. We know that that's gotten in the way of the global pandemic response. We know that that's gotten in the way of cancer research. This is all documented, right? So I'm not just saying these things, that we know this. And we actually have a whole field, a science of team science, that's exploring this, because we know that the fragmentation gets in the way quite a bit. And Cindy, I just want to say, if I can, the sort of coming together across our differences in this room, I was just excited as an organizational psychologist who's taught Psych 101, Psych 111 at Michigan, almost 20 years ago, to talk about Tajfel, Turner, and social identity, and to hear about sort of core social psychological concepts in the School of Medicine. I thought that was fantastic. And because it matters, right? How we understand each other matters. So my dissertation work is, it focused on the experience of coordination. And I want to touch on what Sherry brought up, what you sort of closed with diversity and inclusion. And all this talk of fragmentation, part of what I was trying to get at with my dissertation, which had both ethnographic work, which we do a lot of in anthropology, and experimental work, tried to get at sort of, the individual's experience of coordinating as part of a group. What does it actually mean to feel part of a unit, to feel as a unit? But then also the converse, what does it mean to not feel part of a unit, to feel things as fragmented? So I actually studied the large choir that I was a member of, and the actual lived experience of performing on stage. And the felt experience was really important, because you can't talk while you're singing on stage in front of a paying audience, right? So that there's a sensory perception that we have as humans both when we're actually with another individual, but also as part of a group. In my case, this was a 150-person choir. So we have that capability through our bodily senses to actually feel, when do we click? When do we sync? When do we sound as one? When do we feel as one? As well as when do we not? When are things going off the rails? And in music making, that's really obvious, and playing sports is really obvious, but I think we've all been in meetings where we know things are going off the rails, right? Even prior to a specific phrase being uttered or anything like that. My lab experiment tried to tap into that too. And I bring that up because I think experience and feeling are very, very underrated. And the role of the body and the mind-body connection. And I love that you brought up purse, because nobody talks about purse and theory and pragmatism. And that we walk around with that. Our body is what enters into every room that we're in. Our body is part of every single situation that we're in, along with our brain, right, and our mind. So we have the capability to feel. And part of the experiential feeling side of things, I think, I just love this example, which I need to write more about, the difference between diversity and inclusion. Diversity is a numerical property, right? There are no diverse people. There's no diverse individuals. But yet we still talk like that in academia. There are diverse groups, there are diverse collectives, right? Diversity is a collective level attribute or property. So that's a numerical thing that human resources can check off, organizations, institutions can check off. Inclusion is a felt quality. It's an experiential quality, right? So we can all be in this room, but do we feel more or less included or not? And that has to do with so many different things, which comes to the wicked problem and stuff like that, which I'll get to. But how we sit, how are we facing each other? Were you greeted at the door? Do we take turns with a roll call? Or are we checking on who's in the room? If there's a problem or some sort of discussion that's on the table, is everybody's voice heard in a systematic way? So there's lots of things that we do that can shape the experience, the feeling that matters of being together as one. And so quite a bit of my research taps into the felt quality. So some of that has to do with aesthetics. Some of that has to do with emotions. Again, all things that are felt as humans. And there's so much more I could say about it. So where to start? So I will start where Cindy asked me to start. Because that's a good place to start. It wasn't quite, I think, because you guys covered a lot of ground already. So I really appreciated what Cindy and Eileen brought up in terms of, and I'll get to defining a wicked problem, but basically the fundamental nature of our tendency to fragment and shift into tribalism. So I want to underscore on the one hand, maybe this is so you can be depressed for a few seconds, that this stuff has been around for a long, we have had this knowledge for a long time. And we are very well aware, certainly in social psychology and anthropology, political science, okay, everywhere, that it doesn't take much to trigger in-group, out-group bias. Or specifically, I should say, in-group bias, out-group discrimination, right? That's how we talk about it in social identity theory. It doesn't take much. It could be, like you said, red versus yellow. It could be who got which pencil or a pencil. It could be, if you look it up, the Klein and Kandinsky experiment, right? So basically just even giving people a label. They may even look exactly the same, sound exactly the same background, but you're labeled X, you're labeled Y. Very quickly, I'm going to prefer my in-group. I'm going to denigrate the out-group in ways that are large and small. And so just appreciating how hardwired that is. And so maybe that is cause for some despair. But as Cindy teed up in her talk, but we've evolved, right? There's been a lot of references to the past and sort of evolutionary advantage and sort of the deterministic ways of explaining how we ended up that way. But we are also not in the savannah anymore, right? We've had social media, the built environment, research, right? The fact that the human race and society has been able to reflect on itself, which is what research is. Research is essentially us looking back on ourselves in a systematic way. So we are capable of more, right? So on the one hand, I think from an institutional or organizational standpoint, a societal standpoint, I think it's accepting and maybe being less surprised of the ease of fragmentation. I think that's come up already. Like, man, you don't believe the data that I'm giving you? Whether I'm the World Health Organization or the NIH, you actually don't. It's like, okay, so that happened. And then what? How are we going to transcend that, right? How are we going to take lessons learned over generations of how to do that? And I think we've all experienced ways in which we've overcome and transcended fragmentation. So we know there's hope, whether it's us forgiving somebody else who's hurt us and vice versa. We've all experienced that, I hope, both ways. Whether it's what we witnessed in nations not just going to war but reconciling after war. We have seen this. We know what's possible as human beings. So we need to hold those two things in balance, I think, as we move forward. So both that the fragmentation is really easy to trigger, but also that the potential for repair and coming back together is also there, right? As, of course, today, the United Nations convenes in New York, and figuring out, what's the role of that body in today's global environment, right? So to start and finish, because I'm trying to pay attention to the time as well, what a wicked problem. So this idea of wicked problems really just is a term that captures the complexity of what we're facing. All this is very complex, as I'm sure you're either already or convinced of or convinced of at this point. We have, things are really fraught, whether it's in this country, my own country, Trinidad and Tobago, a small multi-ethnic twin island nation. Racism, capitalism, sexism, homophobia, all kinds of hate and division are everywhere. We're all born into that. I think we all simply trying to do our best, but we all also bear the weight of the system that we're born into, right? Both the privilege and the lack of privilege that sort of co-reside in all of us, right? So for me, wicked problems sum up that kind of complexity that we're living in, right? And the fragility of the ways that we can move forward. So a wicked problem is really, to me, like a ball of yarn. Right, I wish I had a picture of a ball of yarn. But basically, where if you start to pull on one thread to untangle it, you're going to be pulling on other threads simultaneously. And actually, as you're pulling, you're probably creating more knots as you go along. And then you say, let me pull on this other thread. Then guess what? The first thread starts to disappear back into the ball of yarn, and things get knotted up again. So a wicked problem, it seems like every possible solution only solves one part of the problem, and maybe it's even simultaneously engendering other problems, other issues. And those problems involve differences in meaning, values, forms of subjective perceptions. We've seen a lot of that already. They do not have a clear set of choices, nor do they have a clear solution path. And I think that kind of sums up the world we live in. Right? So I'm just thinking of this social media example. Like, I like social media, but then I hate social media. But then I want to stay on it to keep in contact with my friends. But then it makes me feel bad about myself. And then so we have, just scrolling on your phone, you're encountering a wicked problem, right? So one approach that Cindy and I have talked about, and so keep this somewhat general, and then try to get some specifics that we know quite a bit about in terms of addressing wicked problems, is design thinking. Some of you may have be familiar with that. And what I really want to drive home, I'll say a little bit more about that, is what comes to mind when you think of design. What comes to mind for you when you hear the word design? Anybody? Creativity. Oh, that's we need that. Yep. Being deliberate. Being deliberate. Yes. Intentionality. Thank you. See, she's not a plant in the audience, but That's what, yes, I want to get, so intentional creativity, I think is one we can frame that. I really want to get at the intentionality because it goes back to my main point, which is, I'm accepting that we are all biased and we are all hardwired in ways that where we trigger that in-group bias and out-group discrimination, but with this intentional creativity that we can move forward. And I think, sometimes I have these kinds of thoughts and I'm thinking, okay, I got to talk to an audience, and aren't people just tired? And when we try to design solutions, we want quick uptake and we want it to be easy for people to grasp. But this stuff is hard. And I've sort of come to accept that we just need to hold ourselves to a really high standard and say we need to put in a lot of work and resources. It's not going to be easy. So that intentionality is really important. And I think back to your example, Sherry, of it would require intentionality on the part of the School of Medicine to put up a locker room. And I think we all encounter so many things in our own lives, but particularly in our institutional lives, where we face something and we're like, well, why didn't they do that? And there's lots of other things that we take for granted, but we don't realize that it takes a great deal of intention behind it, right? A great deal of intention to figure out, oh, we need an auditorium on the first floor. We need stadium seating, right? Somebody made that decision with a very clear goal and intent in mind. So the question is, we have design and intent in so many parts of our lives. Can we apply that to our interactions, to our approaches to inclusion, to bridging divides, and resolving fragmentation? So just a few things, a few stages from design thinking, in case it helps. So how is this sort of intentionality actually applied? Well, first of all, it requires inquiry, listening. So that's the first thing designers do. So you may have heard of user-centered design, user experience. You ask people, what is it that they need? Design is typically in response to some sort of problem or need, right? So what is it that the people that are involved in that situation, what is it that they need, and centering that? So in the case of fragmentation, is somebody who's engaged in this deliberate process asking everybody and bringing everybody at the table to find out what is your need, what's your interpretation of what's necessary to move forward in this situation, what are the challenges that you face and you face and you face, right? So that inquiry into the needs of people is very important. That's the first step. And designers then would create representations of the needs, right? So there's prototypes, there's models, there's sketches, there's some sort of externalization of, there's a picture created. It could be a picture of words, but some sort of assembling of, hey, this is what we think the problem landscape is. Did we capture your needs accurately, for want of a better word? And then the other thing I want to drive is once, so after some focused conversation and reflection, privileging the concerns of those who are most affected, those most in need, then you try to identify the key elements of the situation. You want to figure out what are going to be the moving parts here. And then this is the other word that I wanted to drive home today is you get playful, right? So we're talking about creativity. So you have to then play in the design process, the design thinking process, with those constituent elements. Right, so it means, okay, we get some of your needs, and there's some key parts, maybe there's some prioritization. Now, how do we have these parts then intersect with each other in different ways? If I combine this and that, is it going to meet just this one need, or can it meet these three needs simultaneously? And so on. So there's constant iteration and playing with those key elements, and testing and experimenting and seeing, does this work? Is it going to meet multiple needs simultaneously? Right? That's what you're aiming for. That's what you're aspiring for. It's never going to be really perfect. I think I made a note about, I think Eileen brought up power and privilege. And in organizations, that's really embedded in a hierarchy typically. And leaders have outsized influence. So the role of the leader in taking charge and sort of pressing and creating coalitions and creating the space and channeling the resources is really, really important. And Stan's still on the call. So if you think of Stan, right, as the dean in his role to say, let's have this series of conversations, that's design, right? I don't work for Stan, so Stan doesn't sign my paychecks, right? So this is not to plug that, but it's just to folks that are in that role with power and resources, we need to hold them accountable, right? Because you need their support. It's not that it's impossible to move forward, but they can make things a lot easier to create cycles of inquiry and iteration, to play, to experiment with how we move forward. Because leaders can also give you the cushion to then fail, right? Experiments fail. I'm sure we're all familiar with that. And folks need to be able to fail and make mistakes, right? That space has to be given to them. And leaders need to make that okay for that to happen if you're gonna really figure out, really approach better solutions. I would just say, again, going back to some of the things that were shared already, sort of the superordinate identity, superordinate goals. I think part of what could be played with to address fragmentation is what's the shared task, what's the shared goal, what's the shared identity that people are ascribing to here? How do we reshape that? What do we call ourselves? That's an exercise in design too, right? Who do we say we are? What labels are we going to develop that can be more inclusive than the labels that we're using now? So actually setting up a series, pardon?
Expand the bubble.
Expanding the bubble, right? So but that can be a design, you can take a design approach and say, we are going to be very intentional with the kinds of labels that we use in this school, at this university. We're probably going to need to try out some things and talk to lots of people to really get that right. Right? And by right, I'll go back to what I started off with the felt qualities, because it's going to be an affective response. It's going to be an aesthetic or emotional response. That's right, right? So to call ourselves X, I won't know if that's right. I can't tell you until I see it and hear it and feel it. Do I feel included with that, right? So that's just one idea. When I walk into this space, how does it make me feel, right? And are things set up in a way that really helps me feel included, heard, centered, all those sorts of things, right? So that's design, applying intent in a very systematic way. So to wrap up and maybe to get a little more concrete, I was on sabbatical 2 years ago at the height of the pandemic. It's great. But I was, okay, what am I going to do? I really wanted to make my research matter. We struggle with that in management. How are we relevant? But I think, so part of that was how can I take some of my research and actually, how do I help healthcare workers during the pandemic be more resilient, battle stress? So I developed an intervention based on some of my research, and we're testing that out with actually folks in the perioperative environment. And we developed this instructional module, and basically, how can we help people better design their interactions? Is one way to frame it. I just came up with that. But how do we give them tools that, particularly across the different roles in the perioperative environment, in a time of great stress, those relationships really matter to help each other out. So how do we help people bridge those divides, better relate across differences, build what we call high quality connections? So one of those things that we talked about in the instructional module was emotional carrying capacity, right? And I just bring that up because that has to do with constructively expressing your emotions with others. And this is all about constructive conversations. So some of the tips that we gave, and that I think if you were to intentionally design, say, how do we design our interactions? And it can't be robotic, and there's, here's the 200-page binder on how you should interact or not interact, because that's not going to work either. But here are some sort of boundaries and norms and general concepts that we might use to shape our behavior if we really care about relating across differences. So some of that, first, there's a few parts to it. So one is, as I scroll through here, is being able to share more emotions overall, being able to share both positive and negative emotions, and also doing that constructively. Right, so what does that mean, that last part in particular? Being constructive with your emotional expression, I think, involves being mindful of sharing your feelings with respect and within boundaries. So for example, we say we want to hear more from, I want to know more about you, I want to know more about your perception of the situation, regardless of who you are. So that probably is going to involve a lot more emotional content than you might be used to in the workplace. So how to deliver that constructively? Well, you probably need to be aware of the other person's emotional state as you start to share, and their stress levels, particularly if you need to talk about something negative. You need to practice defining those emotions and how you articulate them and your awareness of them. And you should also be practicing treating your own and others' emotions as valid, right? To help build trust within that relationship. So you can sort of open the channel and hold that space for the back and forth of more emotional content. Being able to express more emotions overall is useful for giving you more information about the overall situation, right? So understanding, for example, that a coworker is fearful when they describe a particular task or situation. So imagine the perioperative environment, a nurse or anesthesiology assistant, they need to perform a procedure, or they're being charged with a procedure, and they're fearful. And a lot of, what I learned was a lot of nurses were facing things like that in the pandemic, right? Having to do things outside of their training and job description because of staff shortages and because of the expediency that was required. So you had a lot of people doing a lot of very important work, but very stressed out and very fearful. So can they share that? Is there a safe space for them to share that? So then you can then dialogue about how to proceed next. Right? That gives you a better understanding of the people in this situation, how they actually feel about moving forward and confidently performing these tasks. Right? So allowing for more emotion is helpful. And expressing both positive and negative emotions is really useful because positive emotions like joy, hope, and gratitude actually help us see the bigger picture. But negative emotions are also useful because they channel our attention to the problem at hand. So we actually need both, right? So you want to allow for both there, right? So things that you might play with in terms of opening up communication and dialogues, particularly across differences, include inviting expression and ensuring openness and sharing. So actually very explicitly inviting people to open up and share, not taking it for granted that they will do so automatically. And then avoiding destructive expressions and destructive listening and aiming for constructive expressions and listening. So there's a lot of research on listening now, and some destructive behaviors include overreacting to somebody else's errors, dismissing others' emotional reactions, maybe based on who they are, starting to talk before others finish, sending double messages where your verbals and nonverbals differ, which can be confusing. And some constructive expression and listening can include, inquiry into what feelings are tied to the situation, reacting to somebody else's mistake with a question. So what happened? How did that happen? Tell me more. Reflecting back to the speaker how the emotions shared were helpful or not. In this case, for our intervention for patient care, right? So we had these nurses and other roles actually practicing this, and they actually gave us some qualitative feedback as well. And I don't have quotes to share with you, but I was struck by that because even under this very stressful environment, I think particularly for nurses, they still wanted to try something. They were like, give me something, anything. And they took the time to practice. You know what? I gave my colleague a chance to express emotions. I tried to be constructive back with them. Here's what worked, here's what didn't work. So I was really struck by the idea that in that high stress environment, folks were very sensitive to, or they were at least willing to try to be more sensitive to how they were communicating, particularly across the different roles in that environment. So I'll close here. I know we're wrapping up on time, but there's a lot of options available to us, right? So on the one hand, these things are part of our human reality. On the other hand, there's also human ingenuity, creativity, and the power of bodies of research that span across fields that we can leverage. So addressing this really wicked problem of fragmentation, if you can call it design, you can call it whatever you want, but leveraging some intentionality to hearing from everybody involved, gauging a sense of the needs, and then giving that space to experiment and play, maybe with some of the behaviors and tips that I just mentioned, but whatever is needed to address the problem at hand for as many people as possible simultaneously is the goal. That's the aspiration. But it's going to take a lot of resources, a lot of time and energy and money to do that. So I really say, we have to challenge our institutional leaders and societal leaders to put their money where their mouth is. Right. So thank you.
I was just going to say, is this live then? You tried to mute me, and I said my kids would have loved that years ago. Is that this is an experiment in design theory. Then we designed it with intentionality, and we're playing with it, and we're open to getting more feedback and learning more. I think one of the things, we had planned on a panel discussion, having far more time for open discussion, is that I think clearly we've hit a nerve, and that a lot of us really have an awful lot of information that we want to share and that we're desperate to share, but we want to make sure that we've got that time for conversation. So I'm going to punt to Mark and let him figure that out. But the other thing to emphasize, too, is that we hope that this is a safe place, that people do feel that they can share ideas. We're going to stop recording now, just so that we can make sure that people do feel that. And I'm here to share the mic with whoever wants to speak.
Do you want us up
Yeah.
Yes,
So the
please.
recording is stopped. I just stopped it. Right. And those of you on Zoom, just use your hand up function. I'll do my best. Okay.
Do you have any?
Questions, comments, topics that need to be the subject of conversation in the SOM?
Exactly. Great, thank you.
Thank you. My name is Juan. I work here at in the School of Medicine. A couple times, several of you went over tribalism, and it's like historically it was related to resources and scarcity of resources. Now, I think, well, maybe there's this kind of idea that there are plenty of resources to go around, but sort of the idea of scarcity is sort of manufactured, So why? So I guess it's just like the idea of like getting away from that idea that there's scarcity. Maybe that would be a way to like overcome tribalism. And then there was something that you were talking about, the driver of biases, like the worldviews and these cultural mores and stuff like that. And so I guess that's kind of the idea like that I had with just changing those worldviews. Like how do you see, like the inroad to that aside from just, I guess, exposure?
So of our panel, who wants to take a shot at it? Dr. Anderson?
This is what happens when you have your chair as moderator. I love your comments, and one of the things I love about it, right, is that you are challenging us to move from zero-sum thinking, right, to, much more open thinking, right? And, as you were talking, I was thinking about different conversations and different, research that I've been involved in over the pandemic time, where I think you hit a nerve, is that there are people who feel they have so much to lose. And it's that subjective sense of loss that I am going to take my single issue and I don't care what happens about anything else. Or I care so much about the government not mandating, my body to be exposed to something I don't personally know, that I'm not going to worry about other types of repercussions, because this particular value means more to me, right? So I guess what I'm saying is, that zero-sum thinking is so dangerous at the societal level and also at institutional levels. I mean, I see it at play all the time. It doesn't really matter what unit you use, a department, a school, a university, right? There's the perception, there's the, in some ways the lived experience of a zero sum. And I think your challenge to move us out of that, right, where it's a win-win, where you get something that's better for all of us. This is your bubble, right? Mm-hmm. That if different kinds of rights are extended to people who didn't have them before, we all win, right? How do you move that thinking along, right? And so that's an abstract level of thinking about it. But I think your question really points to exactly where we need to go at all the different levels, right? From our micro cultures up to our big cultures, right? And so you're challenging me as a proponent, of moving beyond that to think about how do I keep doing that in the different venues. And it is hard, right? Because we are living in a world and in context where people have lost. Mm-hmm. Right? Where we are suffering, we are homeless, we are, hurt. We have lost, disenfranchised. So, it's also, and thank you for bearing with me, thinking out loud, but this, there's also a both and of honoring people's experiences of pain and real loss and real suffering, and maybe using design thinking, using expanding the bubble, using another model of how, though, we can all, gain more by moving to a win-win. So that's very abstract, but thank you for bearing with me.
Dr. Stevens?
Oh, I just want to jump.
Yeah.
I think it's through education, and I think that's not just a throwaway. I think it's very concrete. So I teach negotiations, and the lesson that I just taught before coming here, it was a situation. So I do a lot of role plays, and it's a situation where the two parties are able to create a lot of joint value. So they negotiate on Monday, we debrief on Wednesday, and I had folks coming back into class on Monday and said, "I won." So it is funny because it's not real. But so as an educator, I've been teaching this class for a while now. I can ignore that, or I can treat that as a signal of something to be addressed. And I didn't realize that those sorts of cues were part of the course for a while until a few years ago, a student actually brought it to my attention because she felt there were these really toxic dynamics that, again, I wasn't aware of because I'm not in everybody's, they're in pairs or in teams. I'm not present for every single set of interactions. And I decided a few years ago to make a change. And so at the start of the class, I talk about virtue ethics. I have a picture of Immanuel Kant. We talk about treating people as an end in and of themselves, not as a means to an end. So that was the first day of class, almost 4 weeks ago. They still came into class and said, I won, which tells you, again, like how easy it is to trigger just by virtue of this us and them. They just went there. So I had to, again, as an educator, be sensitive to that. It wasn't about blaming them, but it was still calling it out and having it be part of our debriefing today. And then also pointing out that this was actually a more integrative, win-win, mutual creation of value situation than a you claim as much value for yourself situation. I also had to be sensitive that I had to give them a bit of a pass because we talked about claiming value and sort of zero sum last week. So I had to appreciate as an educator that they're coming in to this week's class with that on the brain. So I have to be very intentional about, I want to shift gears because I don't want those dynamics. And I don't want them to go out into the world with those dynamics. And we've had, certainly in schools of management, we've had quite a bit of literature looking back on ourselves, especially post the financial scandals of the 21st century. I mean, even before the 2008 recession, and how are business schools to blame? And so we look back at the theories and what we teach, particularly to MBAs, and we've had to call ourselves out and say our theories are actually promoting self-interest, hyper-monitoring of folks, gaming reward systems. That's what our theories are putting out there, and we're teaching it. So of course we're going to end up with 2008, right? So I think the power of education to actually hold itself accountable and be very mindful and design and redesign, and I think we're doing that today, to say what's the actual set of behaviors and practices and principles we want out there in the world, and then to fight for that. The other thing I would add is to vote. Yeah. As somebody who can't vote, I will just say, not that not a citizen yet. I'm very sensitive to that it's the electorate in, most countries, I would say, outside of a few outstanding examples, people don't participate as they should. They don't utilize their franchisement. And that has immense power for, like you talked about, the zero-sum versus an abundance mindset of who you put in those decision-making seats. And also paying attention to local level politics, not just federal level politics. Like who you put, the county executive, who's the mayor, who's his cabinet, all those things matter. And I think folks need to step up for that.
Excellent. I know that Matthias Buck had his hand raised earlier. I don't know if he still has a question.
Matthias? I'm not seeing a hand raised.
Not anymore. Okay.
And we're not getting a question coming through, so
Thanks, Eileen and JP.
let's go back to the...
Other comments? Questions? Somebody had one? Okay, I'll get you next. There's somebody that I think wants to speak.
I don't see it.
Zoom's hard, y'all.
It is.
Hybrid is hard.
Yeah, it's hard. I'm not seeing any hand raised.
It was Doris Evans, I think?
Did she? There she is. She's at the top in the yellow.
Doris, do you want to ask a question?
She's muted.
We're not
Does she
hearing.
need to unmute?
No, she's unmuted, but the volume is still low.
Oh.
It's up high here. Sorry, Doris.
Should we put it in the chat?
We disable the
Sounds of
chat.
guns.
Maybe we can activate chat now.
Learning as
We're still learning, Doris. It's hard to do. Maybe we'll do webinars
We're
format
playing.
next time. Yeah, we're playing.
We're playing.
Says
So JP
Cynthia.
just told me that all the work I do is playing, and I like that, right?
That sounds amazing.
Well, we try and figure this out, Doris. I'm going to move to this question, if that's okay, Mark?
Yes, please do.
My name is Fred Schumacher. I'm in the School of Medicine. Thank you for all the speakers. And I just had a kind of a general comment to get your thoughts on. During the pandemic, kind of, thought we were definitely becoming a tribal nation, and with everything, maybe, not the right word, but fracturized a little bit. And then I read Steven Pinker's book on Enlightenment Now, and was curious of he's kind of outlined, if you take the 60,000 view, we've actually had a lot of successes. Mm-hmm. And so I'm curious, he didn't say that the work's not done yet, but just we've definitely slowed down some of those trends. I was just curious if you guys, since you're probably more involved in this research, if you feel the same thing, or if you kind of feel like we're regressing, or if we're improving, or just your general thoughts on that.
Thank you.
I would say in the big scheme of things, we have had a lot of successes and wins, and just by virtue of the fact that we're all here tonight is, I think, evidence of progress. There's still a lot of work to be done, but at least we're here to have a conversation about it. And so you can't fix things that are sort of hidden or under a rock, or you're not willing to discuss. I think that you also can't work on making things better if you can't sort of get comfortable with being uncomfortable. So we are uncomfortable talking about certain topics. We are. And yet we have to get comfortable with that uncomfortableness in order to continue to make progress. And so, I had someone once tell me, well, I just don't understand why you want to keep talking about this. Mm-hmm. Why can't you let it go? Mm-hmm. And it's like, so the fact that, you don't like talking about it, and the comment was, it's like you're poking me in the eye all the time. To me, as someone who comes from a different viewpoint, it was like, see, that's a perfect example of your privilege, that you don't want or don't feel like you should have to be uncomfortable. Whereas I've been uncomfortable my whole life, every time I walk into a room. And so I think, we have made a lot of progress. We really have. We certainly have. The fact that, we're, like I said, we're here. The fact that there are people who are in academia and professors at majority schools, not solely HBCUs, is progress. I think that certainly within our country, we have made progress at a society level in terms of who our leaders are, in terms of who are running major corporations, right? So I think that there's plenty of examples of progress, but there's plenty of examples of stuff that's not right. Stuff that we thought that we had dealt with, or we should have by now been able to deal with and get right, but we haven't.
I'm going to piggyback on you. I really appreciate your comments. And in addition to being comfortable with being uncomfortable, also I think something that's really been highlighted is learning how to be uncomfortable with uncertainty, right? And it is an age of anxiety. So this is like a new generation, growing up where things are so uncertain, and that brings other kinds of psychological, neurological, biological, social challenges. But what I would say is that, Pinker's tough, and I haven't read that one, but what we have to watch out for is secular trend, and then intercultural variation and intracultural variation, right? On average, life expectancy has done great things in our country, around the world. In country by country, there's a lot of differentiation. Within our own country, we have, certain subgroups of our population with worse health outcomes than the poorest countries in the world, right? So I think we always have to ask, for whom, and by what standards, and what's gotten better, and what hasn't. Like, carbon gas in the atmosphere has not gotten better. Much. So, I think it's complicated, but, the spirit of the question that I really appreciate is in recognizing pain and recognizing loss and recognizing discrimination and where there is a zero sum and people have lost, to also, find the hope is, a moral imperative for us every single day. And most of us at this university, or certainly in academic medicine, it drives us. We have to, right? We have to believe that we have a way to make it better every single day, or why get up?
So I'll just briefly elaborate on that. I think we're at a university actually so Roy Baumeister was a psychologist here at Case Western Reserve. It's now in Florida, but his research is fundamental for illustrating how human beings are just naturally attentive to the bad. So one of his famous papers is titled "Bad is Stronger Than Good." So Pinker's book, and I remember when it came out, but I know there was a reaction against it because it's like, oh, everything's not great. So I think just being aware of that, right, that we do have a propensity as human beings, again, evolutionary advantage, to pay attention to threat, and so we love to complain, but it's not just complaining, but it's that the bad captures our attention, right, to the extent of excluding lots of other things, and then at the same time, but then. It goes back to it's complicated, right? Going back to right, and that's really what I want to drive at. I think in our messaging and in our approaches, like it has to be both and. It has, because you have to. People are going to react against. Oh, we've made so many advances without ... But here's the other work that needs to be done. Right? People just aren't going to. That's just not going to fly. And so providing that more holistic picture and being comfortable with that, because if you look at our messaging, particularly around elections time, it's very simplistic, right? Speaking to the base, or and I think holding ourselves accountable that when we start to create simplistic messaging or receive simplistic messaging, we say, no, there's more going on here. And so to always, as a society, that's my aspiration at least, critiquing that. Like, this is too simplistic, whether it's all negative or all positive. And it's always going to be a mix. And how do we utter those two things at the same time in however we communicate? Because we have to, as you said, hope. I love that you brought that up, right? We have to acknowledge the pain that people are in, but we also can't despair, else we won't move forward. But you have to have both at the same time, and it's hard.
Yeah, we're not where we want to be, but we're not where we used to be either, right? Not where we want to be, but not where we used to be.
I think that's going to have to be our final comment. We're not where we want to be, but we're not where we're used to be. And let's add one more thing. Let's get where we want to go. Okay? And we'll keep the conversation going. There's a reception out here. Thank you to those who were on Zoom. Thank you for you all here. You can go out and quench your thirst, and we have hors d'oeuvres and so forth, right? So
And send feedback to the two of us.
all right,
Let them
very
know.
good.
Yeah. I just said, and we're open to feedback. We're listening.
Yes, please send us feedback. Thank you, Christy, and the others online. Much appreciated. We'll tweak, play, and have another conversation. And the next one is coming up November 30th, and the focus is the impact of tribalism on science, methodology, how we teach, and how we deliver healthcare. Okay? So thanks a lot. Bye.
Thank you.